Hello, welcome to the next in our series going through some of Exodus and Moses' life. So today we are looking at Exodus 7 verse 14 through to Exodus 8 verse 15. And we're going to start to move into the 10 plagues today and really start to see Pharaoh's response to God and to God's power. So if you've not read the verses already, have a pause and read them now. So Exodus 7:14 through to Exodus 8 verse 15. We get then the first two of the 10 plagues, and the first two plagues are of blood and then of frogs. And I don't know about you, but neither of them sounds particularly nice to me, and I'm sure no one found either of them particularly pleasant at the time. And there's some similarities to them both and some differences. So before we really get into them, let's just remind ourselves of where Pharaoh's at, what he's thinking, and just his thought process up to this point. So we've seen that he really doesn't want to relinquish power to anyone, particularly to God, to listen to what Moses and Aaron are saying to him, and they're asking him to do something for a God that they don't even recognize or believe in. He's shown his stubbornness, he's shown the state of his heart, and God is going to use that stubbornness to really bring out his power, to show his power not only to Pharaoh but to the people, to the Egyptians, as well as the Israelites that are there in Egypt. He's shown the state of his heart, he's shown where he's at, and God wants him to see that he should be listening to Moses and Aaron and trust and believe what they say will happen. Let's just state here as well, God is not wishing to cause harm or inflict pain on anyone, but what he's going to do is, using the stubbornness that Pharaoh is showing, using the state of Pharaoh's heart, God is going to show his power, who he is, and show Pharaoh that he needs to stop, listen, and let the Israelites go. So first of all, we get the water in the Nile turned to blood, and it describes in Exodus 7 how it causes a smell and a horrible stench, and it causes the fish in that water in the River Nile to die. And the more we think on this, the more we realise the impact this would have on everyone. Everyone would need to find fresh water. But there would also be an impact on food, because there now would be no fish, or at least they wouldn't want to eat the fish that had died from being in the water that was now like blood, or was blood. Again, lots of thoughts on, was it actually blood that it was turned to, or was it turned to red so it looked like blood, but therefore would be unclean anyway for anyone to use. Whichever way it is, it would have had an impact on the fish. With them being dead, they wouldn't have wanted to eat them. But also the crops would have needed water that came from the Nile. And again, this water would have been different, would have stopped the crops getting the water it needed. And this, in this account of how it's told to us, it sounds like it lasted for 7 days. This isn't just a 24-hour period and then suddenly you wake up and everything is back to how it was before. The water would have been this way for 7 days. The smell, the stench of it. Let's also remember the climate that we are in, being in Egypt, hot, humid. Everyone would have wanted water. The animals as well, we've not even mentioned that. The animals would have needed water for feeding as well. And in the account, it describes to us about, doesn't it, how the slaves had to dig down by the side of the Nile to find any fresh water. This was causing even more work for the people, for the slaves, for the servants than they were already under. And we see Pharaoh just doesn't care. And it even says, doesn't it, he basically turned his back on it, went whatever, almost, and went back into his palace and shut the door. He sees his own magicians being able to do this same occurrence of turning the water red or turning the water into blood. And so he's almost not bothered. He's not bothered. It's not impacting. And so he's like, well, eventually it will go, not impacting me. So why should I relent or change what I've been saying or doing on this at all? I think another part that's really interesting and something for us to perhaps take note of at this point before we go into all the different plagues is that the plagues are not just random things God has chosen to impact or change. Each of them are connected to a different Egyptian false god or goddess or idol that they've got in place. With the Nile, it's the Egyptian deities of Hapi and Khnum. Hopefully I'm saying them right. And when it comes to the frogs, we've got the fertility goddess Heket, who's also the goddess of frogs. Don't really get how frogs and fertility are connected, but there must have been a reason as to why this goddess was being worshipped in that way and was connected to them. So what God is also saying, looking particularly at these two plagues, is not only, Pharaoh, have I got power over you, but I've also got power over these false gods, in this case, Hapi and Khnum, and then Heket with the frogs. And he's saying, actually, Pharaoh, I've got power over these false idols and gods that you've been lifting up, that you've been encouraging the Egyptians to worship. I am better than them, because what have I done but totally kind of defeat and overpower what you are worshipping them for. Those gods, goddesses, idols would have been held very high by the Egyptian people. And not only that, in turn, the Nile was seen as something really to be worshipped and an idol for the country, because they were so dependent on everything that it provided, from the water and the fish to what that water and fish was then needed and used for. But also frogs held a particularly high thing in Egyptian ways as well. So not only are they seeing that God has defeated these gods, these idols, but the very thing of the Nile and frogs have been turned into a bad smell, have been left in a mess in the way it's described for us, are reduced in stature from where Pharaoh would have wanted them to be held and worshipped. So God is really showing his power here and who he is. And then we move on, so we come to this second plague, the plague of blood. So we've seen Pharaoh be really unimpressed and really not interested, not impacted by what has happened with the water in the Nile. But yet here we come to something a bit different. With the water, he would have had slaves and servants that would have been the ones digging down, getting fresh water for him in the palace. He'd have been sat there, doors shut. I'm not really affected by this. I've got my people to get me the water I need. Doesn't impact me. But the frogs is a different story. The frogs it describes to us are everywhere. The palace included in this. The frogs would have been in the palace food around Pharaoh. This isn't something where he can just turn around, go back into the palace, shut his door, shut it out and think this isn't impacting me. He is now really feeling almost that force of God from his stubbornness. And as much, again, we can see the magicians could do that with turning the water red, turning the water into blood, and they could do the same with the frogs. They could make the frogs appear. But something the magicians and the sorcerers couldn't do was get rid of the frogs. And this is where we see a bit of a change in Pharaoh's response. Finally, he's being impacted, he's being disrupted, and he can't see a way out. So he asks to speak to Moses and Aaron. And he's thinking he's still got power here, doesn't he? Because he's actually making a bargain with God. And I find that really interesting, because then as soon as he's made that bargain and the frogs are dead, he goes back on his word. Pharaoh still thinks he's got power, he's got bargaining, he's got control, even in this situation. Throughout both of these plagues and what God is saying to Moses and Aaron, we see they continue to be faithful to God. They continue to do exactly as God asks them. They use the same staff to perform the miracles. They speak to Pharaoh with the words God has given them. And I do think, if that was me, there would definitely be a bit of me questioning how God was going to do all this. How was God going to turn the Nile to blood? How was God going to make these frogs just appear out of nowhere? And I think it's really great that we can see their obedience to God in such a crazy situation, really, of how on earth is this going to happen? How is God going to do this? And we still see they're obedient. And I find that really encouraging, but also really challenging, of how can I be obedient to God in a crazy situation in my own life. May not be a plague or anything really like that, but we all have situations, don't we? And it's being obedient to God, trusting God in that. And we see that Moses says to Pharaoh with the frogs that he will pray to God to change the situation. And he poses this question to Pharaoh of, well, when do you want this? When do you want the frogs gone? And I find Pharaoh's answer really interesting. He says, tomorrow. And if we had loads more time, we could unpack kind of the Egyptian way of seeing things and how things were done, and Pharaoh's experience. In short, in Pharaoh's experience, he would have seen, if he wanted something to happen, he'd have asked magicians, he'd have asked sorcerers, he'd have brought all these people, these wise minds to him, or he'd have gone to one of the idols and worshipped them. But nothing would have been immediate. He would still have had to wait for an answer, because all those people and things he's going to are not God. They are anything but God. So Pharaoh's experience was nothing is immediate. Nothing he wants is immediate. If I was Pharaoh in that situation and Moses says, well, when do you want them dead? When do you want me to do all this? I'd have gone, right now. I'm fed up of the frogs already. It wouldn't have even struck Pharaoh as being an option, because in his experience, everything needs time. So why would God be any different? Interesting perspective there. And again, that's just me doing some reading and my thoughts on it as well, thrown in on that. But just really interesting why he says tomorrow and not right now. What is his real understanding of God? It's not there yet, is it? So Moses prays, as he says to Pharaoh he will do. And I'm sure there must have been some doubt there in Moses again, or maybe not even doubt, but just questions of, God, please answer this. How are you going to do this? But he trusts God anyway, that he's going to answer. And we see that he does. And as we've already said, Pharaoh goes back on his word and doesn't want to know again, seems to show this hard-heartedness coming out again. And we'll pick things up next week, looking at some more of the plagues. But for us to finish today, we may not, as I've already said, experience anything like plagues in our own lives. But the verses from today can encourage us to keep trusting God, even when we don't see how he's going to do it, or it seems like a crazy thing that we are trusting him on. Or even if we're questioning, God, are you even going to hear this? Are you even going to answer this? But I really need you to show up right now. We can trust him. Rather than turning to our own version of idols or people or other things to be our answer, let's be encouraged to keep trusting God, to not be stubborn, but trust him and his ways for all of our lives. God bless.